Let's play musical chairs here.
All right, I have 4 o'clock, so I'm going to call to order the July 24th Danville Utility Commission and ask Ms. Holly to call the roll.
Ms. Kane? Here. Mr. Dobbins?
Here.
Mr. Donahue?
Here.
Mr. Larkin?
Here.
Mr. Nicholas?
Here.
Mr. Shanks? Mr. Smith? Sorry, he's still on the list. Mr. Turpin?
Here.
Ms. Williamson Branch? Did I get everyone?
Are there any announcements? Hearing none, I will accept the motion for the minutes of the June 26, 2017 Commission meeting.
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Nicholas. Do I have a second?
A second.
All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, like sign. All right, now we come to the time where we need to elect a chairman and a vice chairman. We will elect the chairman first. I will accept now nominations from the floor for chairman. Please remember that does not need a second.
I nominate Mr. Bill.
Mr. Donahue has been nominated. Are there any further nominations? Hearing none, I will close the nominations, and if you will indicate by saying aye once the roll is called if Mr. Donahue is your choice for chairman. You'll call the roll, Ms. Holly.
Ms. Kane?
Yes.
Mr. Dobbins?
Yes.
Mr. Donahue?
Yes.
Mr. Larkin?
Yes.
Mr. Nicholas?
Yes.
Mr. Turpin?
Yes.
Ms. Williamson Branch? Yes.
Congratulations, Mr. Chairman. I can do the vice chairman if you'd like me to
Please do, sir.
while you're getting settled, and,
Thank you.
Or I can turn the meeting over to you. Okay. All right. I will now solicit nominations or accept nominations from the floor for vice chairman. Again, they do not require a second. Are there any? Mr. Turpin has been nominated. Are there any further nominations? Hearing none, I'll close the nominations. And again, if Mr. Turpin is your choice for vice chairman, please indicate by saying yes or aye when the roll is called. Ms. Holly.
Ms. Kane?
Yes.
Mr. Dobbins?
Yes.
Mr. Donahue?
Yes.
Mr. Larkin?
Yes.
Mr. Nicholas?
Yes.
Mr. Turpin?
Yes.
Ms. Williamson Branch? Yes.
Mr. Chairman, congratulations. I'll turn it over to you. Mr. Vice Chairman, congratulations.
Well, thank you. I'd like to veer from the discussion of business items from the official agenda momentarily. And what I'd like to do is recognize 3 Danville Utilities employees. One, unfortunately, is former, and 2 are still with us. At this time, I'd like to call a moment of silence for the next minute for Samuel Thompson, Charles Sutton, and David Ward, all who have served our utility extremely well, and we regret the unfortunate incidents that passed this last month. I spent the better portion of my career in industry, and unfortunately had similar experiences in my career, and I only can say that my heart goes out to the families, the employees of Danville Utilities, as well as their families in dealing with these tragic incidences and losses. Greg, would you like to just give us an update on the status of our employees in terms of how they're doing, sir? And I do understand that there was a, call it a celebration of a great life in Louisiana. You might want to discuss that as well, sir. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for this time, and thank you for that opportunity to have that moment of silence. Myself and Warren Martin had gone down to Louisiana at Sam's hometown to represent the city and the utility employees for Sam's funeral. It was unfortunate, but the family thanked us for doing that. We represented the city and the utilities, and we were able to participate with the family as with the family members. This coming October, the first weekend, I think it's October 4th, 5th, and 6th, the family will be coming up to gather Mr. Thompson's belongings, and during that weekend, there's plans to have a memorial service there here in the city of Danville as well. That's being coordinated through Vance Street Baptist Church and the family members. I think once they have everything solidified as the timing, location, and so forth, that'll be shared with the utilities and possibly with the community, because so many people had loved Sam, that knew Sam, and wanted to participate and show their sympathy as well. But as far as the employees are doing well. We're reemphasizing the importance of safety. We have a safety stand down that's going to be conducted tomorrow all day for the Power and Light employees and whoever else would like to attend. But just wanted to share that with you, and thank you for this opportunity to express what was going on.
Thank you, Greg. I appreciate it. With that, we'll go ahead and move back to our standard agenda. And the next item we have is the review of the utilities financial statements.
Good afternoon. Today we will be reviewing the May statements, which is 11 months of the 2017 fiscal year. The first fund is the wastewater fund, which is found on page 9. The wastewater fund reports operating revenue of nearly $8.8 million, which is slightly below budget at 90% and is fairly comparable to the prior year, with a slight decrease of 1.7%, or about $150,000. The decrease is primarily in the commercial and industrial sales categories. Operating expenses are well within budgeted levels at 77% overall. Total operating expenses show a slight decrease of 4.3% from last year, primarily in transmission and treatment expenses, largely due to the timing of certain contractor payments. With revenues coming in slightly below budget and expenditures under budget, net income after transfers is reported at $2.6 million, which is well above the budgeted amount of $1.9 million. This is also very comparable to the prior year, showing an increase of 4.6%, or $117,000. The next fund is the water fund, which is page 10. The water fund reports operating revenue of $7.5 million, which is slightly below budget at 90%. This is very comparable to the prior year, with a slight increase of 0.7%, or $50,000. Operating expenses of $4.8 million are well within budgeted levels at 77% and are less than last year, reflecting a 1.3% decrease overall. This is primarily due to decreases in engineering cost, chemical supplies, and depreciation. After factoring in non-operating revenue and expenses, the fund reports net income after transfers of almost $1.9 million, which is well above the budgeted level of $1.2 million. Current year net income also shows an 8.8% increase over last year, or $150,000. The next fund is the gas fund, which is page 11. Revenues in the gas fund through May are still trailing the budget, coming in at $19 million, which is below budget at 80%, and showing a 1.8% decrease compared to last year. A 7.3% consumption decrease concentrated in the residential, small industrial, and interruptible industrial categories is one of the primary causes for the decrease in revenues. Year-to-date gas purchases were almost $12 million, or 80% of budget, leaving a gross profit of $7.4 million. Total operating expenses came in at $4.3 million, which is below budgeted levels at 73%. Operating expenses are almost identical to the prior year, showing a slight increase of about 0.4% or $16,000. Net income after transfers was $532,000 or 47% of the $1.1 million budget, which is slightly unfavorable compared to last year, showing a 55% decrease or $646,000, which is due to the decreased consumption and revenue for May. The gas cost recovery was an over-recovery of $215,024 at May 31st. We are projected to continue to be in an over-recovery position throughout the remainder of the summer months. The electric fund, which is found on page 12. The electric fund reports operating revenues of $106 million, which slightly trails budget at 86%, but reflects a 6.4% increase from last year. However, when we exclude the PCA recovery line item from both years, operating revenues are more comparable within a 2% increase. Purchased power costs were below budget at 89%. Overall consumption was down 0.6% compared to last year to date, and down only 0.25% this May compared to last May, concentrated in the industrial class. Total operating expenses of $14.4 million are contained under budget at 78% and are slightly below last year, showing a 3.6% decrease or $533,000. The decrease is primarily in transmission and treatment and administrative costs due to the timing of certain maintenance service contracts, less bond issue expense, allocation of internal services from other city departments, and repairs and maintenance to generators. The fund reports net income before transfers of nearly $7.1 million and a net loss after transfers of almost $2.9 million. As you may recall, a $4 million write-off of the PCA receivable was recorded in October, along with a $688,000 write-off of the PCA receivable was recorded in May, both of which had a negative impact on revenues. Removing the effects of these transactions, net income before transfers would be $11.8 million, and net income after transfers would be $1.8 million, both of which would be ahead of budget and better than the prior year. The power cost recovery was a cumulative under-recovery of $9.9 million as of May 31st. We are projecting to see under-recoveries throughout the remainder of the summer months when consumption is higher. Telecommunications, which is on page 13. The Telecommunications Fund reports operating revenues of $1.5 million, which is ahead of budget at 96%, and reflects a 17% increase of $228,000 from the previous year, mainly due to the timing difference of the federal E-rate realized revenue. Last year has 2 less billings than this year. Purchase services were contained under budget at 86%, showing a slight decrease from the previous year of 5% or $7,500, which is related to a timing difference. Last year has 1 more paid invoice than the current year. Administrative expenses are under budget at 72% or $652,000, showing an increase of 5% or $32,000 compared to last year, primarily due to depreciation expense and the allocation of internal services from other city departments. With revenues coming in ahead of budget and expenses contained under budget, the fund reports net income after transfers of $458,000, which is a 69% increase or $187,000 from the prior year, which is primarily related to the revenue timing difference as mentioned above. Are there any questions?
I had a question. I don't know whether you're the appropriate person, but I noticed our PCA, I think our plan to increase the PCA every quarter, it looks to be about 5 mils, or say on a 1,000 kilowatt hour bill would be about 50 cents a quarter increase. But I noticed in July, at least on my bill that I just recently received, we jumped 1.3 cents at one whack, which means that's about 6 mils increase. That's a $6 a month increase all at once on 1,000 kilowatt hour. And are we going to continue to have these large increases, or why have we deviated from the plan?
I might have to defer that to somebody else.
We'll have to research it and get back to you, Mr. Turpin, but there is a quarterly increase
Right.
planned.
That's just a big increase all at once.
I trust you'll let us all know the answer.
Yes.
That was, there were like 4 of them planned, right? Each quarter?
Yes.
Yeah,
It was only 5.5%, I mean, 0.005.
Yeah. Well, 0.0005, I think it
Yeah.
was, yeah. 0.000530. And we went up 1.3 cents in July. 0.013.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any further questions?
Well, yeah, the point being, Mr. Turpin, that was both a recommendation from here and also approved by City Council, if I remember correctly. The timing.
I don't know if a formal approval occurred.
I think it did, but we'd like to know that too. I believe it was a recommendation by this body to City Council, I thought.
Now, I do recall that when the last presentation we had from our power consultants, they indicated we was going to have to go up more than we anticipated because we were going to have higher costs than we anticipated. So I don't, that's maybe part of it, but I don't know the details exactly.
Actually adjusted on a quarterly basis for under or over recovery based upon the pricing that we're receiving from the market. However, we have an extenuating circumstance due to the length of time in which we did not make those normal adjustments. So it would be helpful to not only get that information at the next meeting, but I would prefer that that information be dispersed to the commissioners as quickly as possible. With an explanation. Do we have any other items regarding utilities financial statements?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
I'd like to make a suggestion that we alter the format of how we do this in the future. Our staff does an excellent job combining this information, and we get it ahead of time. 90% of what we just did was having the information in front of us read to us, which there are some great questions from this commission that we had to wait until the end to ask those questions. What if in the future we simply have whoever from staff come forward, relay information that's not in the written report, any that might not be in there, and then get directly to questions? I mean, why do we sit for 10 minutes going over numbers that are in front of us and have been in front of us for weeks? I would suggest we alter our format going forward.
Further discussion?
Yeah, I would just say that it is helpful for me to go through it with staff. And I understand your concern with time, but I find it useful. And I'm not going to argue with you, but I'd like to hear from others to see how
I'm throwing it out there. I mean, I can certainly be one of 7 that feels this way, but it seems to me that we're all on here. We all know how to read a financial statement and can certainly read the information in front of us, and from that produces questions. So my suggestion is let's just get right to the questions. That's just one person's opinion.
Well, I think since we've got some new members on the commission, it might be well to stick with the current format till they get a little more familiar with things. I think that'd be helpful.
That would help me. I understand the issue and what you're saying, and I'm sympathetic to that. But I also find, having been in numerous venues with lots of financial statements in my career that I've worked on, that there is some value in seeing these, and I guess the main point I would add, sometimes I'll see an issue or a question as these are presented that I didn't see just in my review, prior to a meeting like this. And being, the new kid on the block, that makes a difference too. So I appreciate that remark.
I also agree with Mr. Turpin. I think it's helpful to me. I'm still fairly new, but I like to hear the numbers as well as looking at them, because sometimes we can ask questions that you can come through and just already clarify that for us.
And myself being new, I also agree it would help to have some of the breakdown that you just read beforehand versus trying to look at these numbers and not really know the percentage changes and everything and what impacted those numbers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome. So I understand there is no...
I'm not making a motion. We're
Suggestion? I understand the commissioner's point. One thing that might be helpful is what we're looking for, obviously, is a variance analysis, and you do a very nice job of going through the exhibits. But, a technique that sometimes is used is to highlight on the statement where we have those variances, both positive and negative. So one thing you might want to think about doing is color coding these in the packages where there's something that you want to bring to our attention. That might be an option that could be used using a green, red, yellow type of coding, perhaps, that would flag for the commissioners where they ought to pay attention to things, and might be able to help you drill into things in a little more precise manner. Just something for you and Michael to think about, okay? Thank you. I appreciate it. So far, so good. Next up, I believe we have the BP gas supply update. Is that correct?
Yeah. Anything that makes it more efficient.
Excellent. Hey, Becky, how are you? It's good to see you.
Becky Meadows. I'm with the Water and Gas Distribution Division. I want to introduce to you Dominic Sung. Dominic has been here before. He's spoken at one of Megan Baker's key accounts meetings. Maybe some of you were at that meeting, I don't know. Dominic is currently the Director of Structured Products Americas in BP's Integrated Supply and Trading business unit. He focuses on consumers in the eastern United States. He helps clients to create and execute risk management solutions across the energy value chain and tailors it to their specific needs. He works to meet their unique energy needs in numerous commodities, including natural gas, crude oil, power, crude products, and natural gas liquids. He's been with BP for 14 years, and he's held a number of roles in trading, gas supply, structured products, credit, risk, and trade control. Dominic currently lives in Houston, Texas with his wife Patricia and very young son Elijah. They are expecting a baby in just a few weeks. So we're very glad to have Dominic with us here today. We're very fortunate to be able to bring him in here. He's going to give you an update on our gas supply situation.
Thank you, Becky.
Thank you, everyone. It's my honor to be here in front of y'all today to speak. I know you guys wanted a bit of a broader overview of the natural gas supply market and how the supply and demand balances are, so I will try to keep it at a pretty high level. There's a lot of information in the packet, but
you don't need to read the disclaimer, okay?
No, I'll skip through that.
He's not going to like that, all right?
I do have to say, all I will say about the disclaimer is that if there are any mistakes, they're my mistakes and not BP's. Okay. So what I wanted to do is at least kind of have this be a dialogue. If there are specific questions, we can delve into that. But otherwise, I will try to keep it at a pretty high level. And if there are questions, please feel free to interrupt and ask those questions, and we'll dig a little deeper if we need to. So I structured this to at least go through the supply aspects of the market then the demand aspects of the market, a little bit on pricing, and then some of the transportation issues that are coming up.
I do have a question for you before you get started.
Yep.
Okay. So the market, you've portrayed this as a North American market, when in fact the market is very quickly becoming a global market. I find that intriguing. Why?
Why do you find it intriguing, or,
No.
or why is that's a difficult question?
Why are you talking about a North American market today? I hope you're going to talk about the context of how that's changing extremely rapidly into a global market, which is potentially going to be globally traded very, very soon.
There will be parts of it in there, yes, for sure,
Good.
specifically about the LNG. Yep.
All right.
So if we skip through the disclaimer, the first thing we want to talk about from a supply perspective is storage. Nationally, this is essentially what, if you look at this graph, the white line is the 5-year average of storage. The gray band is the highs and lows, the whole range of where we've been. The blue line at the top is where we were last year, and the red line is where we are currently. So if you think about where we were coming out of a not-so-cold winter, the red line is where we were coming out of winter, and so even with a not-so-cold winter this past winter, you're lower in storage significantly than we were the year before. If you look at where the red line is now today, and then what we've done is project 3 different possible scenarios just to give you kind of a little bit of a cone of probability. So the orange line, if you were to have what we would view as max injection rates similar to that kind of mimics the 2014 injection rate. So coming out of the polar vortex winter, if you can remember that, where it was really cold and we had to inject a ton of gas back into the ground to be ready for the next winter. So that would be your high case of what would go back into storage. The low case would be last year, where you were coming through a summer where there were really, really high power usage and it was really hot. So not as much injection during the summer because you were pulling a lot of gas and using that from the marketplace to meet the power demand to cool homes and businesses. So that's the low case, and then somewhere in the middle is the gray line, which is the 5-year average activity. So just to give you a perspective where we'd be, if you had a high case, you'd be well above last year, and you would have a lot of storage in the ground. If you have kind of a hot summer, which we're looking at what we're currently doing, that's kind of the trajectory we're on. It's been pretty hot. There has been a lot of power usage, and every week for probably the past 3 or 4 weeks already, we are coming in under expectations for what's going into the ground. So what we're setting up for is going into the winter with potentially a lot less gas in the ground nationally than last year. If there is a cold winter, unlike we had last year, and if there is more power demand, and if there is a lot of demand that Chairman was saying is kind of coming on, and we'll take a little bit more look at that on the demand side in a little bit, it sets itself up for some volatile prices in the winter coming up. There's a lot of data on this next slide. I will shorten it to this. If we look at these are graphs about rig counts across the U.S. What we usually tend to look at as an indicator of production is whether or not rig counts are increasing or decreasing. So correlating to that, if there is an increase in rig counts, you would expect there to be more production. If there's a decrease in rig counts, conversely. If you look at the total U.S. rig counts in the top left graph, the bulk of the change is in red on the oil rigs, the increase at least. And that is particularly due to the growth in rigs and drilling in the Permian Basin area in West Texas. And that's everything going there on the shale oil. And so to that effect, you have a lot of associated natural gas that comes out when you drill for that oil. So there's a ton of gas coming out as associated natural gas in production in the West Texas area. The other growth area on the natural gas side, if you look, and we've isolated just the northeast rigs in the upper right graph, you'll see the rig counts increasing in the northeast. Not at as high of a rate, but still increasing. But what you do see is even with the increase in production that's coming out, and again, the bulk of that is in the Marcellus and Utica shale plays in Pennsylvania and West Virginia, you're still not filling all the pipeline expansions fully. So there's a little bit of a balance there that's kind of yet to be seen how it plays out.
So let me ask a question. So where's the capped rig, the capped well count analysis in what you've provided us here? Because there's a ton of capped wells up in the Marcellus and Utica that are just sitting idle.
If you flip to the next graph,
Good.
So we would refer to those as the drilled uncompleted wells, or DUCs.
The DUCs.
On the oil side, those are increasing. Just as they keep drilling, they're increasing the inventory of drilled uncompleted wells. In the right graph, you look at the natural gas DUCs, and those have been decreasing, but at a slower rate. So what we're waiting to see, and again, there's some lag in the data that comes out from the producers. What we're curious to see is if that slowdown in decrease in DUCs is truly just due to price and they're not producing because it's uneconomic to produce, or whether they're actually replacing all of the wells that they're putting online with new wells that are being drilled. There's, I think, two sides of a coin in which there are some folks who would put out there that there's an infinite amount of supply that can come online at $3 an MMBTU, and there's some people who may disagree with that to varying degrees, but some people might purport that I think that at $3, a lot of the plays in Pennsylvania, in the Marcellus and the Utica are economic at $3 an MMBTU. Yet to be seen, I think, because we haven't consistently been there for too long, but and again, there's lag in the data, so we'll see what that kind of does as we go forward.
How reliable is the data? I've heard that it's not as reliable as we'd like to think it is in terms of how many DUCs are really out there.
There is a band of reliability, and a lot of it has to do with the actual producers and how they classify the rigs, whether they're oil rigs or gas rigs. And there's some variation in it, but it's within a cone of reliability. There's general acknowledgement that, general trends of increasing or decreasing. But yeah, there is some disagreement in that data.
Okay, so the trends are probably valid.
Trends are similar.
Where it lays, maybe plus or minus 10, 15%.
Correct.
But, okay.
Somebody may disagree on a precise number, but the trends are generally there.
Cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So in summary for the supply, sorry, I didn't have that up, I apologize. In the summary of supply and where it's going, the US EIA is projecting a return to growth in supply in the United States. So they are probably the lower bounds of the forward range on the blue line, which is the US EIA, and then the broader gray range is a host of other market pundits, so Bentech, Pyra, and other analysis folks who are projecting somewhere in that range. But the general trend, again, is an increase in production as you go, and it points towards what you said in terms of this being a much more global market and pull coming from a lot of different places. If you go to the next slide, we'll start talking about the demand side of the equation. So again, it's a bit of a balance, right? Trying to balance supply and demand and storage all together into one picture. What we're seeing as we go forward is essentially the U.S. being a shift towards a net export market. Now, I know we've talked about this a bunch of different times over the years of, well, we're going to need to import via LNG, so you build the terminals, and now we're going the other way. But as you see it, the net pipeline imports in blue are decreasing, and the net LNG imports are obviously decreasing and switching to the other side. So we've already started exporting. Things are going. I know there's a lot of questions of how real LNG really is, but this graph is showing basically the trend and the current level and then the projected level of the U.S. being a net exporter to a rather large amount. More specifically, if you look to the next slide for the LNG exports, the right graph shows you the approved and under construction and projects that are going. So, in 2016, you had Sabine Pass 1 and 2 trains come on. In 2017, you see 3 come on, and then they're working on 4 and Cove Point 1, and then again in 2018 and 2019, Freeport, Cameron, and Corpus Christi coming online as well. So the left graph shows actual deliveries to, what we're trying to model there is to show you what's going to the Sabine Pass, which is the first LNG terminal that's come online and started flowing. In the beginning of that graph, what you see are the commissioning cargoes, so you'll see the big spikes up and then the big drops down for a little bit. They have to have commissioning cargoes to test the facility to make sure it works first. So you sent the one, then it goes dormant for a bit, and then it started to flow in earnest. And again, what we're mimicking is the deliveries from the pipelines to that facility. So you'll see those 3 colors, but that's essentially the deliveries to that facility specifically. There was a big maintenance outage there in October of 2016. As you can see, the whole thing shut down for a bit, but the deliveries are increasing. And so you kind of see consistent increases as they brought on Sabine Train 1, Sabine Train 2, and now Sabine Train 3. There's some maintenance and outages, and then, of course, when you send the ships, there's a little bit of a break in when they decrease the deliveries to there. But as you can see, the deliveries are going, they're taking the gas, and it is being sent. And that's Sabine, and then Cove Point's coming, and Freeport is coming as well. BP is involved in Freeport Train 2, so I can vouch and say that those are coming and going. I think a lot of people may debate, well, are these really being sent out? Is it economic? Are the spreads there? But if you really think about some portion of these, I mean, as big as they are, the production has been forward sold, right? So you've contracted for long terms of these things, and then there's some of it that's going to be swing based on the economics on a day-to-day basis. But like it or not, it's going, and that's the direction it's going. And what we've kind of shown there in the right graph is the capacity for it to continue to go in the total of volumes per day. In BCF per day on the y-axis of the right graph that it could potentially ramp up to. Yes, sir.
Gain in nuclear capacity coming online between now and 2020, which is not very far off. Where is that occurring geographically? I ask this because you hear so much negative about nuclear plants and the difficulty in permitting and creating that new capacity.
So that was a projection, and that includes essentially the Vogtle plant and the Summer plant. So the Summer plant's in South Carolina, and then the Vogtle plant is Georgia. And so, yes, there's some delays. So I think you can probably take it with a grain of salt. If you will look, so essentially what this graph will show, the one I have up, is a lot of shift to natural gas demand from the power sector. But the nuclear is still there because those plants are still projected to come online. I think there's a lot of debate because of the bankruptcy of the EPC contractor. In both of those cases, they also happen to be the technology provider. So that's put a lot up in question. And the 2020 deadline is because they had to hit the 2020 deadline when, at the time this data came in, to get the tax benefits for the nuclear. I think the last I heard, they're looking to push that deadline back to give them a little bit more time. I'm not sure if they've actually completed that through the Senate or not.
If I understand you correctly, are there primarily 2 projects that account for that massive increase?
They're huge projects. So if you look at the following slide, this is what we've kind of taken a look at data to look at. So there's 2 reactors at both of these sites, and they're both quite large. And they're both going concurrently and both by the same EPC contractor and technology provider, so they're kind of dealing with the same issues. The Vogtle plant is via Southern Company, and then the Summer plant is SCANA. And so if there are problems, they're kind of both going to have the same problems. And what we've sort of projected here is if it goes the way of the Kemper plant in Mississippi, where it's had a lot of problems and gone away, and the commission in Mississippi has told them, and that one's different, it's not a nuclear site, but if it's one of the in-ground carbon capture sites. But if it goes that direction and it doesn't work out, and they tell them to flip solely to natural gas, we've kind of roughly tried to estimate the increased natural gas demand if the nuclear doesn't go through, which is pretty significant because both of these are, I think the Vogtle plant alone is a 1,000 megawatt plant. So it's a lot of, what's that?
3,000.
Yes, sorry, 3,000 for both reactors, correct.
What about the timing of that conversion or switch over to gas in lieu of nuclear, if that ends up being?
I think you wouldn't need all of that generation right away. So if you were to tell them to go to natural gas, you could do it in more of a modular way. But if you're going to build the nuclear, they're set up to build the whole projected amount all at once. So if they were told to switch over to natural gas, it would be a little bit more ratable over time, but it would be pretty chunky as the projected load needs are there. So it's in the initial projections for those 2 nuclear facilities that come online, because that is the trajectory that Southern Company and SCANA are trying to work out. Is how do we? I mean, they're already billions of dollars into this thing. I think they may have some political egg on their face if they were to pull the plug this far into the game. But you know, if they can't complete it and they don't get the tax credits, then they may not go. So if they get pulled, then obviously you can pull that nuclear out of there and essentially flip that over to natural gas, just because those are going to be the most modular. Those are going to be the cleanest and fastest to get up in terms of fast start and put in.
And that brings up another question. If that occurs, the effect of that huge increase in demand for natural gas and the impact on price.
Right. Yes. In theory, again, some people might say there's plenty of production to meet that demand, and then, you know, for pipeline expansions, since they aren't fully full right now, there's capacity to take more gas away. So ramp up production, fill the pipes, and you should potentially be okay, depending on who you ask. But there's additional capacity and more coming in terms of capacity to move natural gas. So once we can go through that in terms of the timing, but once those come online, it would back half of 2018 and 19 will kind of be some of the initial wait and see moments of how the expansions fill up, where the gas flows, how it affects some of the pricing in terms of the regional pricing dynamics and how that plays out.
So one could speculate that the Southern Company's interests in placing a gas turbine generating facility here is no more than a hedge.
Good point.
May never be built. Might be built, but if it needs to be built quickly, it can be.
Thank you.
So all I would say about the power demand is it adds volatility and it adds load to the system. Typically, right? And so again, whichever way that coin falls, I think on the nuclear is a pretty big swing one way or the other. And then similarly, this is just an example we have in here. So this is what we refer to as the other duck curve, as it looks a bit like a duck. If you look at a typical spring day in California, as they've put on a ton of solar generation, just to give you an idea of what stresses this puts on the system. So during the day, your generation needs decrease dramatically between, basically when the sun is up, right? When the sun goes down, your need to ramp up via natural gas is tremendous. And so as it's grown, you ramp up to need 13,000 megawatts in 3 hours. So the question is, what does that do to the volatility of the natural gas market as you kind of go through it, and as more and more solar gets put on across the country? What kind of volatility does that bring to the natural gas market and the swings that you have to do? Because you're scheduling natural gas daily, on a daily basis, and you're adjusting some of those pipes, are trying to balance out the need for hourly power demands. It becomes really tricky, particularly when you have to ramp up that fast and that hard. And then do you have these natural gas or fossil fuel-based plants that are quick start and fast fire, needing to be maintained for just a few hours of runtime overnight? How does that all play into the mix? It becomes really tricky. So all it does, what I would say is it adds,
especially when it's not built into the rates for solar.
Yeah.
Because in fact, we're paying for that.
Yes.
As solar gets subsidized,
Yes.
it has a hidden subsidy that people don't even realize.
Yep. So I would interject that just it adds a lot of volatility to the market, and it brings a lot of uncertainty in whatever that, it pushes it in different ways, right? And those costs are shared burdens for taxpayers among a lot of other people as you build infrastructure to account for that. This is a graph of industrial demand. What I'll summarize the left graph to say is most of the projected projects for industrial demand of natural gas are located in the mid-continent part of the U.S. and then in the southeast, as you need I think people tend to stray away from areas where there's higher governmental risk, and then they need to be in closer to areas where you have access to water to get the products out. So what are the actual projects? The right graph kind of leads you into that of fertilizer projects, gas to liquids projects, LNG projects, and methanol projects. So essentially, the bigger projects, industrial and commercial projects, have to do with taking cheap natural gas and turning it into something that can be sent somewhere else to fill a need and to fill the demand in other countries, in other places. So whether that's ethylene crackers or methanol projects or whatever that is, taking the natural gas, turning it into something that can be sent elsewhere. Pretty large growth there. I think we, as the largest marketer of natural gas in the United States, get the phone call typically when these projects are looking to get supplied. So there are a ton of projects, the viability of which is debatable up and down, depending on what that may be, but we hear all of those phone calls and we see all of those projects, and there are a ton of people looking to figure out how to get cheap natural gas from the U.S. elsewhere. And so it's not always in the form of natural gas, it could be in the form of a chemical product or whatever it may be, but that's the bulk of the commercial industrial demand ramping up and coming online. And then the next graph, is Mexican exports. The inset graph that you can see is essentially what has happened. So that is the real growth of Mexican demand and Mexican drawing of natural gas cheaply out of Texas, essentially, across the border. Texas and California along the way. So the more messy graph on the left is the infrastructure that they've built. So again, the Mexican demand story is replacing, so they've deregulated the Mexican market, and that's happened fairly quickly. They've said they'd do it for a long time, but it's actually going now. We have some of the capacity going across the border, so we're seeing it, and we just started flowing in July. But the crux of it is they haven't done a good job of replenishing their drilling program. So the oil drilling program hasn't done what it's supposed to do. When it was under, they had a lot of political strife and all that, so they hadn't maintained the program. Most of their power generation and commercial industrial burns were oil-based before. As those decline rates have increased, they look across the border and say, okay, well, there's cheap feedstock there. How do we tap into that? And that's essentially what they've been trying to do, is for power demand and for commercial industrial demand, switch a lot of it over to natural gas and tap into the assets that are just across the border. So that's where it's been, that's where it's going in the right inset graph, and then there's an additional, in bullet points 4 and 5 in the lower right, an additional, let's call it almost 3 BCF a day, that's coming online by middle of next year. So again, increasing exports to Mexico. How does that play into price? So this is just a graph of what the forward curve looks like for NYMEX natural gas. So this is the base part of what your commodity costs are. The gray range is the historical range since January of 2015, so really not that far ago. The gray range will show you kind of how high and low this thing has swung in really less than a 2-year span. What you will see, what we've tried to do is put a time series here. So the red dotted line is a year ago, and then in sequence orange, yellow, blue, and then to black today. So traditionally when you're looking at planning for these things, as a curve would generally look, if you were to really look at what the red dotted line looked like, would be what we would say you would normally see. Every year increasing risk, less liquidity, more risk. So every season, every year has a little bit more risk factor and a higher price built into it. What you've seen though over the last year is this curve completely flip on its head. So when you're looking at planning, you would really typically only look 12, 18, 24 months ahead for a lot of folks, because you were building in more risk and more cost. What we've seen is this thing kind of shift on its head, and in my 14-year career, you haven't seen this situation that frequently, maybe a small handful of times, where the curve is what we would call backwardated. So the front end of the pricing curve higher than the further out part. So what that's allowed folks like the city of Danville to do is to take advantage of the structure of the market to be able to secure what the costs are for a much more significant period of time at what seems to be the lower end of where things have ever been. So, you know, if you really look at years 2020, 2021, 2022, and 2023, to be able to lock those up around $3 is pretty significant. And that has not been there for very long, and who knows how long that will stay there because of, again, the picture and uncertainty of some of the things that we discussed in both the supply and demand side of the equation. So to be able to take advantage of that, I think is an advantage for a consumer like yourselves who has the credit and the ability to go further down the curve to lock in the security for your ratepayers and rate base. That's really all I had on the pricing and that end of things. Before I move on, I didn't know if there were any questions on the price bit. Yeah.
So if we were to lock in, as you're suggesting, would there be the possibility of locking in too large of amount, or making a commitment to too large of a purchase?
I think a lot of that would be...
In other words, if the weather continues, our winters continue to be like they have been the last two.
I think that your utilities folks do a good job of making sure that they have good estimates of what your load at a minimum will be in a warm winter scenario versus a cold winter scenario. So while there is a possibility of doing that, I think they are pretty good at making sure that you don't overhedge too far.
Mr. Chairman, didn't we just go through a period where we overhedged?
Mm-hmm. We did.
I would say you guys did it in a much less significant way than others. I mean, we had a pretty unseasonably warm winter last winter, but...
I would say historically, we began hedging, if you recall, Fred, back in 2000, early 2000s, and the department did a very good job in really providing us about the lowest cost gas in Virginia for quite a few years. So the knowledge exists in the department, I believe, to work with our consultants and deliver pretty well, deliver much better results than the typical utility in Virginia has afforded its ratepayers.
I wish Jason or someone else was here with some history, because I was under the impression that we had to actually write off some of those as losses, at least for temporary. Were you here then? It was, well, I'll tell you what.
Becky was here.
Jim Hart was still alive, I guess.
So Jim and Becky work very closely together. Not to put you on the spot, but I think you all overall have done a very good job. You can't always be perfect.
I understand, but my concern would be...
Depends on how much risk you want to take. If you're going to take a little bit more risk, you are going to, at times, have to dump. But I think we've also had more issues, actually, on the electric side this year than we have had on the gas side, if I recall that correctly, mainly due to the fact that the merchant market on the electric side is much less in cost at a kilowatt hour basis than we're paying off of our lowest cost asset, which is, way away on the Illinois border, right, sir?
How does our current and recent cost to our utility operation for natural gas compare to the spot market, current market price of gas? And it kind of goes to I think the point Fred was asking. Our hedged cost, I guess, is what would be the cost.
You need to come up to the mic, Kelly.
I can't hear.
We can table a couple of these questions till the end. I can take those questions directly, and I've got a few slides that might help reset the table for you. that's what they're intended to do, is to tell you where we're at today and where we're going.
Okay, sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you. There you go.
All I might suggest is that it's difficult, I think, in your seat or in Kelly's seat, really, to kind of Monday morning quarterback some of the hedging decisions that are made. But what I would say is that if you look at where the black line is versus where the range has been, I think you might look at that as saying your risk, if you were to say, you know, how much risk are you really taking to the downside? So if you hedge right and are over-hedged, or if you hedge and the market tends to go lower, then you're out of the money on some of those hedges. Your risk to the downside is significantly less than where this might go to the upside. And so to call into question maybe hedging further or ceasing some of the hedging activity, I think what we would say in a lot of risk management and hedging is consistency and sticking to the plan. It tends to work out better. Obviously, there are going to be some fluctuations in where that goes, but particularly in market scenarios like this, where the risk, I mean, you're at close to all-time lows, right? And so your risk to the downside is zero. Your risk to the upside is, as we've all seen, if you've been around long enough, was 12, 13, 14, 18, 19, $20 in MMBTU. So
I find it, I was reading about Australia's gas situation, which is absolutely horrible. Folks in Eastern Australia are paying, what, 12 to 15?
If they
even
can
higher, if you can get it, because they've oversold their ability to get it across the continent and get it into LNG. And they've got contracts that they've got to fulfill. So, I mean, it's ugly. And I've got friends who are working on did the Gorgon plant, and did the next one that Chevron's putting in on the western side. It's just crazy. Crazy.
That is an interesting story. I will leave for you to look at the headlines for that.
It's well worth reading about. Yeah. So Kelly's going to cover a little bit for us, it sounds like, the variance versus the market. Is that true, sir? Okay. Let's keep moving.
I'll just breeze through the last bit of this. I thank you for letting me take this much of your time. We could go on ad nauseum for hours, but I will do this relatively quickly to show. The next slide is essentially a lot of you guys are in a pretty interesting spot in terms of where these pipeline expansions are coming, and what I wanted to do is highlight three of the major ones kind of coming into your area in this Transco Zone 5 area. The Mountain Valley Pipeline, TECO Westbound Express, actually four of them, sorry, Atlantic Coast and Atlantic Sunrise. So this is a bit messy. We even tried to strip out a lot of the pipelines, but the dotted lines are where the expansions are coming in, and then I did a slide on each one just so you kind of have an idea. So the next slide is Atlantic Sunrise. I think that one is the prime one, the biggest and probably maybe one of the more important ones that's coming in. It taps the cheapest cost of gas and the lowest economic production and puts it into Transco. So this is a $2.6 billion project that's supposed to come online middle of next year in June. And it connects the producing regions in northeastern Pennsylvania to markets in the mid-Atlantic and southeastern states. What you see in the lower right-hand side are who are the contracted volumes, and I think the interesting part in all of these is, traditionally when you would look at long haul or larger chunks of transportation and who the anchor shippers tended to be, they were utilities and municipals. I think in all these expansions what you'll see is the anchor shippers are producers, which is a complete difference in how the market has tended to work. So it used to be demand pull. Now what you're seeing is production push because they need to get it to a market somewhere. So again, I think a year or two ago, as you had a lot of financial issues with some of these very leveraged producers, this called into question a lot of the expansions, because if that producer, let's say in this case, a Cabot, who is a 850 MMCF a day of the total, if they went away, you would put the entire expansion into question. So it brings an interesting aspect that I think we've never crossed that border before in terms of production push versus demand pull for who's contracting for the long, chunkier parts of these expansions. But the Atlantic Sunrise is probably the biggest and takes the cheapest gas and puts it into Transco. And again, if you want to delve into these further later, I would just say you can get a decent picture of what these look like just by looking at the map. You can see where it goes.
When does that pipeline flow reverses at the Maryland trunk?
I guess it reverses the traditional south to north flow. Because this would be a new expansion, you're not really reversing anything, but it would be flow from Pennsylvania south towards essentially DC and that area. And then further on down, if that demand isn't soaked up there, all the way down to the southeast.
Yep.
Mountain Valley Pipeline, 2 BCF a day, $3.5 billion project. It moves it from, again, West Virginia, and then moves that south right to your backyard, Pittsylvania County.
How much of that pipeline capacity is sold?
That one is, I believe, on the order of 90-95%. Wow. But what all of these should do is alleviate and truncate some of the winter price spikes, right? The ability to get more gas in the area should hopefully truncate what that daily risk tends to be in the winter of when things just get clogged and everybody's pulling. The next one, Atlantic Coast Pipeline, $2.7 billion project with a late 2019 start. That one is pretty much dedicated for Duke and their power, Duke and Piedmont and Virginia Power and their power demand. So that will hopefully, again, ease some of that power demand swings on the Transco pipeline and some of that, as they've got now their own direct access to some of that cheaper gas. Westbound Express, TECO Westbound Express, another one that this is a very short one, but I think pretty crucial to connect using 2 new higher power compressor stations to move gas in a different way, connecting Virginia and West Virginia, and then that will link Marcellus gas into further East Coast and West Coast and down to Coke Point as well. So those are some of the things on the horizon. I think what you'll see is...
Okay. So, but the subscription model is to shippers, it's not necessarily to consumers. So while it's subscribed, it doesn't necessarily mean it's sold.
Yes.
Okay. There's a reason I'm asking. It's not doesn't have to do with this. So.
Yes. You could go and find these people and
cut them a deal.
Potentially figure out, I mean, it'll come to market.
Yep.
And be available. Except for the Atlantic Coast, which is earmarked for Duke and Virginia Power.
Dominion, Virginia Power. Yep.
But yeah, so what you'll see is potentially some shifts in the way the basis market, the regional pricing plays out. I think what you'll find is a lot of people, as we have one FERC commissioner and not a quorum to approve a lot of the things that maybe need to go through the FERC on the national level, that may, if there are things that come up from a permitting standpoint or things like that, that may push these projects behind schedule. So I think the market from a pricing perspective tends to wait till the absolute last moment before you start swinging prices up or down, because these projects may or not be on time as they're covering a lot of mileage and ground, and God forbid if you come across some bird sanctuary or something that you've got to pause for, or some landowner has an issue, or you have an issue crossing a river or whatever that may be. So the market reaction on price will probably wait as long as possible into 2018 and some of these into 19 before the regional pricing dynamics really start to change as they see what those flows will be. I may have gone a little bit over.
I had a question.
Yeah,
sure. And I got to preface my mark so you know where I'm coming from. I came up during the 70s when we fought for every MCF we could get here at Danville from FERC during the curtailment at the time. And we were running out of natural gas. So we had to curtail industries and so forth. Had to run propane air plants to meet the needs. Having said all that, and we went from feast to famine and famine to feast very quickly back then. And it looks to me like we feel like we've got plenty of natural gas now and we're shipping it everywhere, overseas, et cetera, et cetera. is anyone looking long-term from a national security standpoint? We may need that gas supply in the future because it's going to run out quicker than you think the way we're burning it and going to ship it all over the world. So somebody needs to watch that. And we're going to be right back to where we were in the 70s one day, a gas shortage. Is anybody looking at that?
I think that they've known that these reserves were there for a significant period of time. You know, they can understand the geology and what's available. The technology wasn't available to tap into what we have now tapped into for shale gas. At the time during the 70s and 80s, you've now unlocked a tremendous amount of supply. I think we know what's there and they can project how that goes forward. The trickier part is, like you said, if anything happens at the federal level and they put an order in place or tell people you can't fracture the rock anymore and get that out, that presents some other issues that we may then face if you can't tap into that supply anymore. Is it there? I think the answer is yes. Do we know the capacity of what's there? I think the answer is yes. But does an outside force, governmental or other, change that? Don't know. Are people looking at it? Sure. Yes. I think a lot of people are. Hence, I think my statement about how some people would say you have a pretty unlimited supply, at least in our longer term view, at $3 that you can get it at economically. You might have some variations of degree on either side of that. But
thank you.
That's it. I will turn it over to Kevin.
Thank you, Dominic.
Thank you all. Thank you for having me.
It was a very good presentation. We appreciate it. So, well done.
It's really a blessing to have someone like Dominic fly up from Houston to give us a market update. I think I promised to make an effort to explain a few things. So a couple of the questions that I heard is maybe at one time did we over-hedge, and it's a confusing question. Did we make arrangements to buy more gas than we could consume? And I don't think that that was the case after discussing with Becky. I think a couple months in the entirety of our existence, maybe a couple of months we may have. And I'm not sure if we know what the financial cost of that was off the cuff, but let me update you on where we're at today and some recent activities that we've had. If you look at this graph, the yellow bar does look like we're approaching the total volume that we might need for a given month. The green is actually the hedged volumes. Some of those volumes, let me back up for a second. When we talk about our volumes, there's the total deliveries that we receive at Transco Citygate. That includes Blue Ridge Fiber and Goodyear and some transportation volumes. The volumes that I'm presenting here today are the balance, the ones that we're responsible for procuring. And over time, Becky's procured on average about 75% of that volume. That's over a 5-year period. And some of the hedges that you see that are at $4.18 a decatherm, those have been made in previous years, and we did an extend and blend and tried to mitigate what the negative effect of having been on the wrong end of the price curve. We discussed you can't always win when you're hedging, and no one has a crystal ball. So we have some significant volumes purchased out to the end of 2020, and we've been looking actually to March of 21. And when I arrived, we began getting on the same page, Becky and I, about procurement and the price situation that Mr. Sung described, that showing that we're on the low end of the volatility, and I can bring that curve up for a minute, caused us to begin to look out the balance of calendar year 21 and a couple years beyond. So we've been looking out to December 24 and looking at the market. And rather than make a big purchase, we decided to layer it in and made a purchase for 25% of the volumes out to December of 22. So it ended up being 21-month period. We've got triggers set for the balance of that winter. That would be January, February, and March of 2023. Seems like a long ways off to be talking about procuring natural gas, but so the price that we received for those 21 months was $2.97 a decatherm. And just for example of what futures prices might be this winter, January is trading at about $3.30 right now. So anytime that curve reverses and there's an opportunity to be 33 cents discounted for that period, it seemed attractive. So we're keeping an eye on that, and of course there's an opportunity every day that the market may present us with. So that's why we've set those triggers for the balance of the winter, and of course BP knows we're looking at that entire time frame, another opportunity, and we're considering that now. Another layering, 25% through the balance of calendar year 24, and those prices are attractive, especially when you average them winter and summer. Of course, our volumes are heavily balanced toward the winter months, but we're looking at those at a month-to-month, a year-to-year, calendar year, all kinds of different opportunities. The volumes aren't very large, so you don't really know what the price is. You can kind of get an indicative price. The marketing people can come back to you and tell you what, that they're able to strike a deal for sure. But we're looking at those, and a couple of the, I'm trying to think of the other question.
So let me ask you a question while you're going through this. Now, I'm just remembering back when I was on the commission earlier, our hedge horizon was much shorter. I see we're making very long horizon hedges with respect to our prior decision process. Why did we change?
You mean, why did we choose to look out further than a couple of years?
I mean, because you could say 418 a decatherm hedge, that wasn't probably the best hedge in the world.
Right.
So, and that has to do with a long-term play, okay? And if I recall, and Becky could correct me if I'm wrong here, but we used to generally look out no more than 2 years. Is that about right, Becky? So it would be interesting, I think, for the commission to understand why the change in strategy to a longer duration hedge.
Well, of course.
Which has some both downsides and upsides.
Right. And you can always be second guessed when you're looking at a commodity market. It's the third largest commodity.
It's not second guessing. It's a change in strategy. That's the difference.
I hear what you're saying. Well, I think if you're asking me why I'm interested in calendar year 22, 23, and 24.
No. That's not what I'm asking. Let me repeat it once more.
Okay.
Okay? The question on the table was, when did the department begin to make long-term hedge bets versus a shorter-term strategy that was prevalent in the mid to late 2000s? And why?
I suspect the polar vortex had a lot to do with a change in perspective. No one wants to tell their customers, sorry, we don't have any gas available.
So I think it would be beneficial for the commission to know that that was what occurred rather than just a suspicion.
Let me ask a question.
Because that's probably not the best bet, long term.
If I'm understanding your graph here, you're saying in January of 17, we hedged 5 years worth of gas supply. 75% of our gas supply, we hedged it at a $4.18 a decatherm.
that transaction predated that, actually. That what I'm saying in January, do you say January 17?
Yes.
In January 17, the total volume that we thought we were going to need to deliver was based on a 5-year average. The total volume that was hedged on that given month was 75% of that total, which meant that we were going to be in the market for the 25% by design. So the question was asked, could we overhedge? There is a little bit of buffer built in by design.
What period of time are we hedging? What volume are we hedging for? Annual volume, seasonal volume, or?
It's month by month, historical monthly consumption.
So, and we hedge 75% of those monthly volumes for 5 years ahead.
Yep, that's what I think I'm seeing.
And we're paying $1 more than the current market value.
I probably have to yield to Becky on the original terms of that, but the original terms may have been much shorter at a higher price, and in order to mitigate the higher price, I believe they did an extend and blend, which is a financial tool to.
I think we're getting back to where I was referring to.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
That's exactly right.
Exactly.
I remember it being a serious issue that we had, and I don't remember the year, but I remember it made the monthly reports look horrible in terms of gas. And eventually we switched it over to an accounts receivable or something that got switched in the books. But I remember every month we were worried about the decatherm cost.
So it would be very beneficial for you to come back next month and let's go through this in detail. Because if we made a fundamental change in strategy and it wasn't brought up to the commission, I'm very concerned. That's a decision not to be delegated to staff. Okay?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't know that there was a pronounced change in strategy. I mean, I simply looked at the market data as what was available, and it looked like an opportunity to me. And we made a small volume purchase.
You know,
it sounds like I'm sorry.
Go ahead, sir.
It sounds like we're talking about a time prior to what you're actually addressing.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So it's not intended to be brutal questions here, but I'm trying to get back to the history so that we know. I think there was something we need, as a commission, need to learn from.
Well, I think it would be very beneficial to sort of come back to you and discuss, what is our capacity on the pipeline, what transactions do we make, how do we handle imbalances. There are some things that would be very informative to share with you. But I want to be clear that there's not been an announced change of strategy where we've determined that we're going to buy gas out 10 years in advance. But there has been some compelling market data that suggested that a year's worth.
Looks like we went out 5.
Yeah, let me ask you again, Kelly. Are you telling me that we're locked in to paying 75% of our supply at $4.18 a decatherm till April 2020?
Yes, sir.
Which is way over projected market.
35% over.
It is today. Obviously, at the time that purchase was made, it seemed like a reasonable hedge to make.
It's
Yeah. Things that predated you and probably predated me when I've been working with y'all.
Yeah, we haven't seen you before. Not on this podium. Okay.
I've been on the back end of working with y'all for 7 or 8 years.
Yes. Yeah, please do.
Well, all I would say is that hedges that were in place for a significant period of time were, part of the strategy to look shorter. And as, again, we came out of the years, so out of the hurricanes, I would say, in 2000 and, golly, when was that? 7, 8, I think, Ike and Rita and Katrina. when you had $12, $13 prices and there was no shale gas and people thought things were going to 20, I believe that was when a lot of the longer term hedges were put on. A bit of a reaction to that. So as those prices were coming down, they've become more and more out of the money, right? When you had the paradigm shift of shale coming online, you already had these $4 and $5 hedges in place.
I have to apologize, but I left the commission, came back a couple of years ago. I had a preconceived notion that our fundamental horizon on our hedging strategy had not changed. We've been a little surprised today, but also not just me. So I think it would be very beneficial to understand what that strategy is. And you have to understand our sensitivity here, okay? Because we're looking out for our ratepayers, and we're dealing with obviously a long-term issue in our electric fund.
Very similar.
And it sounds like we may have a little bit of an issue here in our gas fund that I'm glad we know about today, okay? But that we might be able to mitigate somewhat.
So just to answer your question specifically, though, while those prices are at $4 and change, they were at $5 and change. And so what Kelly's talking about in terms of blending the prices down, we had increased the volume at, let's call it about a $3-ish price to average it down, to pull that down to they were already existing hedges that were there in the $5 range that we
you were able to
averaged
pull
down.
down and blend.
So you added more to dilute it.
That's
And then you had to extend the time to do that.
right. That's exactly right.
I would just add, I don't think any of the points, questions, issues swirling around this part of the discussion is intended to kill the messenger or put anybody on the fence. This is just basic, and I think you said it earlier, global changes and huge domestic changes in supply that looks like it's probably going to be there for a while in growing amounts, and that could and probably should change the way we strategize compared to what we've done in recent history, intermediate history.
And it's going to change faster than most people will end up predicting.
Yeah. And one question, which is really for today, but assume we remain at $3 spot current market and that holds or even lower. I assume the way the gas utility department works is that benefit can be passed on, a substantial part of it, to the consumer.
Entirely.
When it occurs.
Yeah.
Not in advance, but when it occurs.
That's right. Our purchase gas costs are entirely passed on to the consumer. We don't share any savings if we were able to generate some from derivatives or something complicated.
Good.
It's entirely, so all this is on behalf of the consumer and not for the utility fund or the reserve fund or a transfer. It's entirely for the customer. One comment, if you're saying that in light of the new production and new transportation projects that are coming online, if you're much more comfortable being in the market, I would say I share that comfort. And I don't necessarily pronounce that we need to be at 75% hedged. And I think that is a ever continuingly changing philosophy, if you will. As we get new information, we continue to rethink what should our strategy be, and our exposure to $7 gas might still be there, but is it as real as it was 5 years ago? I don't think it is. But if you're comfortable with dealing with the volatility that comes, there is a great return on taking some risk with that.
Well, I think it would be beneficial to do a retrospective for the last couple of years in terms of what our hedging has produced for our ratepayers. That would be a good analysis to do. And, we discussed here the fact that, the weather, generally speaking, the 5 and 10 year averages aren't our friend. You know, it's been getting warmer. So I think that you've got an opportunity here as you look forward, you know, working with your consultants and with your team, you know, to come forward with us with some information that I think would be very beneficial for us. And remember, we're very sensitive, and this really has to do with the election fund.
Mr. Chairman?
To bring it forward. Yes, sir.
I was trying to recall, I don't ever remember the 2-year time frame since I've been on here. But what I recall, we sort of went along with whatever our consultants recommended. We had a gentleman named Doug that was one time recommending, and then B&P got involved and they recommended these hedges. And I don't remember us ever getting into the details of the time frame. We just sort of relied on whatever they recommended, and the staff, I think, implemented that. And when I was trying to understand the 5 years, I'm not trying to be negative or critical of it. I'm just trying to understand if that's what the situation is. So
what you're really looking for is a transaction summary.
It just sort of built up, I think, as these different people recommended things. And as you said, when the shale gas started coming on, it just threw everything out the window. What we
also the reversal. We're having a discounted basis right now, which we never thought we would enjoy. So gas is beginning to flow south.
Right. And you're probably going to want to think about that as you look at your strategy. And you know, as the discussion of, well, the pipeline is filled by pushers, not takers. Pushers is a far different opportunity in the market than takers, right?
Absolutely.
And then you've got the play of, you know, the issues in terms of, you know, so I think we just like to be a little bit better informed.
Yeah, one comment is I share that. I want you informed. I want everything to be transparent. That's not an issue. You realize it is a marketplace. So if we were to have to come to you to make a transaction,
we don't want that.
Yeah, that would not work very well.
But, generally speaking, and again, I just recalling what I remember, you know, we had a guy by the name of Aubrey. I don't know who Aubrey used to work for.
Hilliard.
Hilliard. And, you know, Aubrey'd come and give us his pitch, and he'd look good in a nice suit, you know. And then the next month, the transaction plan would be laid out, and they'd let us know what it was going to be. That's kind of what I remember. And it used to be, you know, kind of a short-term look, I think I remember. But things have changed. That was pre-shale gas.
Right, and I think you see over time that the opportunity kind of came to us, and they were at the bottom of the volatility curve. But that doesn't mean that it might not improve. We know that. I love cone of certainties, but it's more of a cone of uncertainty. But we'd be glad to come back to you and discuss further the strategy and any transactions we might make.
Again, we don't want to talk about your transactions. We want to just talk about your strategy.
Very good. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see where we're at. Oh boy, that was it. So at this point in time, we'll finish up our communications. Mr. Larkin?
Yes, if any commissioner has any specific questions at any time outside of our meeting schedule, you're always welcome to email or call us. You can call me or Jason, and we can try to get answers. And if it's something that's for the good of the group, we'll share the question and the answer with the entire group. We're glad to do that, so you don't have to wait on a monthly basis for those kinds of things.
There is a requirement on that communication, though, once it goes beyond 2 members. Is that correct, Clark?
No, you can send it, and then he can email back to everybody what the answer is.
Right.
That's foible.
Electronic meeting becomes when you all are emailing back and forth, and it's always simultaneous communication, and that becomes the potential for an illegal meeting.
Thank you. I just wanted to make sure we had a clarification on that. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, a group email with everyone chiming in is a different story.
It's a problem.
When somebody sends me a question or Jason a question and we answer it and send it out to everyone. It's just providing information.
Thank
It's
you.
all foilable, though. Anybody who'd want to get that information can get it.
Thank you, sir. Do any of the utilities staff have anything that they'd like to cover at this time that they haven't covered already? Any public comments
In addition, one thing.
at this point in time?
In addition to the tape, I think we've taken enough notes to where we can communicate to Jason the
Perfect.
information that you want for the next meeting.
Thank you.
And he asked me to mention to you that the Center for Research and Public Policy will be here next month to present the results of the survey that was taken in May.
Oh, excellent. We participated in that survey. It was very well done.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
We got good response on it. I think they had some travel issues last month, so they'll be here next month.
Sure. With that, do we have any other items that we need to bring forth? Do we have a call for adjournment?
So moved.
Second? Second. All in favor, I said, heard everybody say yes. Thanks.
Yes.